Welcome everyone, and thank you for coming today. I'm Susan Yaki, the director of the La Follette School of Public Affairs. On behalf of Lonnie Berger, the director of the University of Wisconsin's Institute for Research on Poverty, and myself, I welcome you to this event, 50 years after Kerner, Problems, Policies, and Pathways Forward. Some of you may remember the Kerner Commission, but for others of you, it was established before you were born. President Lyndon Johnson created the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders in 1967 after 4 summers of racial unrest and violence in U.S. major cities. The Kerner Report attributed the causes of urban violence to white racism, as well as a neglect and isolation that it produced within African American communities. The basic conclusion of the report was our nation is moving toward 2 societies, one black and one white, separate and unequal. Today we are delighted to bring you 2 speakers who will discuss where we are at 50 years after the Kerner Report. First, we're going to have some contextual remarks by Dr. Alan Curtis, followed by a keynote address from Dr. Bradley Hardy. After Dr. Hardy's talk, both Bradley Hardy and Alan Curtis will take questions from our La Follette School students. Please join me after that Q&A for a small reception right outside these doors. Let me tell you just a little bit about both of our speakers. Dr. Bradley Hardy is an associate professor at the School of Public Affairs at American University in Washington, D.C. He's also a non-resident senior fellow in economic studies at the Brookings Institution. He's a visiting scholar with the Center for Household Financial Stability, at the Fed in St. Louis. Professor Hardy is currently on leave from American University, where he's working with the Russell Sage Foundation. In September 2018, Hardy and a co-author wrote 50 years after the Kerner Commission Report, the nation is still grappling with many of the same issues. Dr. Alan Curtis is president and CEO of the Eisenhower Foundation. Dr. Curtis was the executive director of President Carter's Interagency Urban and Regional Policy Group. He served as urban policy advisor to the U.S. Secretary for HUD, and later administered a $43 million employment and crime prevention demonstration program. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Alan Curtis to the podium.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Susan. I appreciate that. I grew up in Wisconsin, graduating from Pulaski High School on the south side of Milwaukee. Pulaski had 3,000 students and not a single African American. Milwaukee today is the most racially segregated city in the nation, surpassing even Detroit. That's about the way it was in 1964, when home in Milwaukee from college, I worked as Deputy Democratic Party Director for Voter Registration. Lyndon Johnson was running against Barry Goldwater. You all see that in your history courses, I'm sure. Now, Goldwater had these really cool bumper stickers, AuH2O, chemical formula for Goldwater. So they were so cool, we had to do something about it. So I got my then 10-year-old brother, Jeff, and his best friend, Gordy, to take LBJ stickers and paste them over the AuH2O stickers at parking lots on the south side of Milwaukee. I was really contributing to the delinquency of minors, but we called it reframing the debate. A few years after the urban protests began in the 60s, in Detroit, in Milwaukee, in Newark, and 150 other cities, President Johnson formed the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, known as the Kerner Commission. I think I just inadvertently clicked it on, sorry. The Kerner Commission was named after the governor of Illinois, Otto Kerner, who, by the way, was later indicted and served time in prison. The commission concluded in 1968 that America had a long way to go in reducing poverty, inequality, and racial injustice. In 2018, the Eisenhower Foundation and its National Advisory Panel, including icons like Marian Wright Edelman, published our 50th anniversary Kerner update titled Healing Our Divided Society. And we concluded that America still has a long way to go in reducing poverty, inequality, and racial injustice, but that we've learned more about what works and what doesn't work in those 50 years. If you want a copy of our report, just talk to me afterwards and I'll be happy to send you one. Since the Kerner Commission, we have twice elected an African-American president. There has been a dramatic increase in the number of African-American and Latino elected officials. The African-American and Latino middle classes have expanded. Recent films like The Hate U Give, Black Klansman, Black Panther, If Beale Street Could Talk, and Hidden Figures have all, in their own ways, made positive and important cultural statements. But today, the realities that James Baldwin communicated to Robert Kennedy that night in New York City so many years ago continue to resonate. Neo-Nazis have made their statements in Charlottesville and in many other places. Black Lives Matter has revealed what Americans did not want to see in Ferguson and in many other places. The Kerner Commission criticized the police, and today, zero-tolerance policing has failed. Mass incarceration is the present iteration of slavery and Jim Crow, and I encourage you all to visit the magnificent new Legacy Museum in Montgomery, Alabama. Sentencing laws remain racially biased. About 200,000 people were in jail and prison in 1968. Today, especially thanks to the crime legislation of the 1980s and the 1990s, the prison industrial complex holds over 2 million, and they are disproportionately people of color. Yet the present reported homicide rate is almost as high as when the Kerner Commission was issuing its report in the 1960s. So you can ask about the real progress. In many ways, mass incarceration also has become part of our housing policy for the poor. That housing policy has included conscious, purposeful, government-created segregation, as Richard Rothstein eloquently has documented in his new book, The Color of Law. Public school segregation has increased since the Kerner Commission, beginning with the backward-looking federal policy of the 1980s. Overall, child poverty has increased. Deep poverty has increased, in part because of what the late journalist Molly Ivins accurately called the welfare deform of the 1990s. The ratio of African American to white unemployment has remained just about 2 to 1 over the 50 years since the Kerner Commission. Income inequality and wealth inequality have dramatically increased and were greatly reinforced by the supply-side created Great Recession of 2008. The speed at which the rich have been pulling away from the rest of us has accelerated since the Kerner Commission. Most of the economic gains from rising productivity since the Commission have gone to the wealthiest 1% and to corporations. In the 1950s, top corporate CEOs made about 20 times as much as their workers. Today they make over 300 times as much as their workers. Slaves were not, of course, allowed labor unions, and today corporate America has attacked unions, even though a majority of Americans favor unions. Corporate financiers brought us the Great Recession, yet they have not been punished. They have not been adjudicated into the prison industrial complex, which is a source of their profits. In comparison to all other industrialized democracies, America has the highest rates of incarceration, homicide, and overall child poverty. Yet I suggest to you this afternoon that none of this really has to be. To begin to heal our divided society, we need to accelerate the movement to base policy on evidence, not ideology. Only a very small percentage of all federal programs are evidence-based. All that federal money and so little evidence. What are just a few examples of evidence-based policy that does work? The Kerner Commission's recommendations began with economic and education policies. Today, that means we need proven, demand-side, Keynesian economic policy that carefully links job creation to job training and then to job placement. Training first, not work first. Job placement needs to focus on rebuilding the nation's crumbling public infrastructure and on significantly expanding technologies to reverse climate change. The priority needs to be on public investing in poor, working, and middle-class Americans rather than on relinquishing still more power to the rich. The package of demand-side economic investments in average citizens needs to include a higher minimum wage, more power for labor unions to improve life for workers, trade policy that benefits workers, and single-payer health insurance for all Americans, issues that I'm sure you'll be debating in the year ahead here. Such demand-side policy can both stimulate economic growth and reduce inequality. A carefully thought-out Green New Deal can both reverse climate change and reduce inequality. What does evidence-based policy mean in education? Well, we need housing and therefore school integration combined with much more equitable financing of public schools and greatly improved training of public school teachers. It is essential that a return to public school integration incorporate new curricula that instill a strong sense of identity and pride in students of color so that they can thrive in white space after graduation. What does evidence policy mean in criminal justice? Aware of the astronomical costs of prison building, states like California, New York, and New Jersey have reduced their prison populations by over 25% in recent years without any really significant increase in crime. We need to accelerate such reductions across all states. And we need to appoint to the Supreme Court opponents of mass incarceration, like Michelle Alexander, Sherilyn Ifill, and Brian Stevenson. What evidence-based, place-based policies can be co-targeted in specific geographic locations with truly disadvantaged populations? In poor and working class neighborhoods across the nation, we need real community policing, not just the rhetoric that we hear. For example, we have assembled considerable evidence in locations as diverse as Puerto Rico, New Hampshire, South Carolina, and San Francisco that community-based nonprofit organizations can partner with carefully selected police officers to simultaneously mentor youth, reduce crime, reduce fear, and increase trust in the neighborhood. Such more innovative community-based policing should be deployed to help stabilize neighborhoods in a way that encourages the kind of community-based banking that was so successful before the regressive federal urban policies of the 1980s. The Shore Bank experience in Chicago is a prime model. The community-based banking should encourage community economic development corporations like Bed-Stuy in the Bronx and others supported by Robert Kennedy to construct affordable and integrated housing. The housing construction should create jobs for community residents and for returning ex-offenders who benefit from evidence-based reintegration models like the Minnesota Comprehensive Reentry Plan. The jobs should also be framed as youth development. The youth development should scale up evidence-based models like Youth Build, President Obama's My Brother's Keeper, and the Eisenhower Foundation's Quantum Opportunities. Mentoring should be continuous, high school, middle school, elementary school, and all eligible children should receive preschool. In other words, evidence-based policy that works targets multiple solutions to multiple problems. Evidence-based policy is complementary and interdependent. It is not separate and unequal. The scaling up of what works needs to be financed by the scaling down of what doesn't work. What doesn't work includes multi-billion-dollar trickle-down supply-side tax breaks for the rich, racist and massively expensive prison building for the poor, zero-tolerance policing, supply-side school vouchers, which, as you know, have failed in Milwaukee, and privatization of schools. In response to the failure of trickle-down supply-side economics, we need to increase taxes on very high incomes. We need to return to the federal policies of the 1950s when top income tax rates on the rich were 70 to 80%, over twice what they are now. If he were alive today, I believe Robert LaFollette would agree. What doesn't work also includes excessive reliance on catchphrases like voluntarism, empowerment, and self-sufficiency. And most of all, what doesn't work includes false 1980s rhetoric on government being the problem. In fact, the problem is dishonest government and corporate greed. The solution is good government in partnership with a well-managed and greatly expanded nonprofit sector. Progress with Kerner priorities also can increase American soft power globally. Kerner progress can communicate the importance of American values to the world. Contrasts can be made to the human rights atrocities committed by Russia and China in places like Tiananmen Square, Tibet, Muslim East Turkestan, and Syria. Americans can be reminded of how China is committed to a long-run strategic campaign that propagandizes authoritarian values as superior to democratic values. To help combat that strategy, Nobel laureate Joseph Stiglitz and I have argued in our Kerner 50th update that we very much need new soft power. Yet new soft power and new evidence-based policy cannot emerge without the new will that the Kerner Commission said was necessary for progress. What is the use of evidence in our presently threatened democracy if there is no will to take action? 50 years after the Kerner Commission, the creation of new will may be harder to achieve than ever, but we must begin. In that devastating year of 1968, Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy both were advocating for a multiracial economic justice coalition across the poor, the working class, and the middle class. The creation of that King and Kennedy Economic Justice Coalition, which embraced the civil rights movement, needs to be the point of departure for the generation of new will in the 21st century. MacArthur Genius Award winner Reverend William Barber can help lead the way, but his National Poor People's Campaign against the immorality of poverty and inequality needs to be joined by many, many other constituencies, and we must find a way to better coordinate the advocacy. The multitude of Kerner New Will constituencies includes Americans who reject the culture of inward-looking selfishness begun in the 1980s and who, in President Kennedy's words, ask what they can do for their country. Those Kerner constituencies include Americans who reject the selfish admonition that you're on your own, and who instead recognize that we are in this together. Those Kerner constituencies include most of the 99% of us who have suffered the inequality, greed, and malfeasance of Wall Street. Those constituencies potentially include the 18 million white Americans who live in poverty. Why are they not voting for Kerner priorities? Those constituencies include millennials who, during the recent midterm elections, finally started to vote in greater numbers. And I think that Generation Z can do even better. Those constituencies include a women's movement in which women of color and white women settle their differences. Those constituencies include the majority of Americans who either want to keep immigration levels the same or to increase immigration levels. Those constituencies include universities which need to create new multiple solution degree programs that integrate Kerner policy analysis, training on the rules of evaluation, training in how to communicate what works, and real-world experience in grassroots advocacy. And those constituencies must include citizens on the right and the left who just might be able to find at least some common ground on issues like infrastructure repair, expanded preschool, genuine community policing, more extensive criminal justice reform, and new soft power. Crucially, the generation of New Will must be facilitated by the creation of a fairer, more responsive American democracy. If the votes of all Americans were actually given equal weight, a new economic justice movement would have a better chance of reducing poverty, inequality, and racial injustice. That is why we must intensify the fight for campaign finance reform, intensify the fight for voting rights reform, intensify the fight for control of gerrymandering, and intensify the fight to abolish the Electoral College. I commend former Attorney General Eric Holder for taking on these issues. Equally important, the generation of New Will must be facilitated by reform of the media, which were criticized severely by the Kerner Commission. We must, for example, take regulatory action against social media platforms and feedback loops that push addicted users deeper and deeper into their own hermetically sealed bubbles. The movement for a new will and for a new economic justice coalition needs to emerge at the grassroots, outside of government. But legislation and funding must build on good government at the local, state, and federal levels. It is fashionable to advocate for what some call the new localism, and we must encourage it, especially while our society remains so deeply divided. Yet we cannot give up on good federal government, however long it may take to return. Good government and President Lincoln freed the slaves. Good government and President Roosevelt legislated the National Labor Relations Act, Social Security, and the bloodless revolution of the New Deal. Good government and President Obama brought us the Affordable Health Care Act that expanded coverage. Good government and President Johnson secured the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and the Fair Housing Act. Good government now must invest in Kerner priorities at a scale equal to the dimensions of the problem. On all of this, I challenge the La Follette School to partner with us. How can the faculty and student body of the school better spread the word on the lack of progress in reducing poverty, inequality, and racial injustice? How can the La Follette School better construct and evaluate what works as we continue to advocate for policy based on evidence, not ideology? And most importantly, how can you here, my home state, with your noble traditions of social democracy, reverse the inability and unwillingness of so many universities, faculty, and students around the nation to generate new will, especially as we head towards 2020. As we hopefully generate that new will, I respectfully ask that you never forget how long the dream has been deferred. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? Or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat? Or sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Perhaps that dream just sags like a heavy load. Or does it just explode? Thank you.
Bridget, I'm just trying to make sure I can get these back. Oh, okay, good stuff. Great. So, you know, Alan's talk dovetails really nicely with some of the stuff I want to share with you this evening. And so, you know, I'm coming at my research from the perspective of a labor economist who thinks a lot about social policy, labor market interactions, income volatility, and just how social welfare policies can improve overall economic well-being. And I think that we're really echoing each other quite a bit. So I appreciate your remarks, Alan. So, you know, first off, I want to acknowledge that this project really came about from support from the Russell Sage Foundation. There's an entire volume that the foundation set up that has scholarly articles assessing the Kerner Commission 50 years later and the whole range of implications and why we should care about it today. So thanks to Sheldon Danziger, Suzanne Nichols at the Russell Sage Foundation, and then importantly, Susan Gooden and Sam Myers. They are the co-editors of that volume. It's my view, and I'll mention this at the end, that this should be kind of required reading for folks who want to do place-based policy in any contemporary sense. And then finally, my co-author, Marcus Casey, outstanding urban economist, labor economist at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and Brookings. So thanks to all those folks for helping this come about. So again, you know, just to kind of start off, we have this diverse room, and it's multi-generational. And so I just kind of want to remind and introduce some of the broader background for the Kerner Report. This National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, it's referred to as Kerner for the chair, Otto Kerner. They're directed by President Johnson, which in and of itself is a big deal, a presidential commission, directed by President Johnson to really figure out three things. Why riots are occurring in major U.S. cities outside of the Southeast. What specifically is going on? You know, I say riot, I say civil disorder. That's kind of an opaque term. What's happening on the ground level? And this actually starts to speak to the sorts of skills many of the current and prospective students will get from a public affairs education, thinking about problems both quantitatively, qualitatively, all sorts of data collection to triangulate around what the truth really is. This is a big deal. And how can policymakers prevent something like this from occurring again? And, you know, we'll talk about some of the numbers here, but, you know, first you have the commission here on the left side, and it's a pretty relatively diverse commission for the time, though you will see the paucity of gender diversity, which was common for the era. You had one commissioner from the state of Kentucky as a woman. But on the right-hand side, it's important to contextualize that, you know, Johnson at the time had already enacted his Great Society of very ambitious social welfare programs. I mean, many of the programs that folks in the room have used or will use, for example, Medicare, Medicaid, came about from prior policy action from President Johnson. And here he's seen on his tour where he's basically starting his war on poverty, he's touring Appalachia. And so many of the programs that we see today, even including the expansion of food stamp benefits, these things didn't just happen. It really did occur, much of it throughout the 1960s, predating this civil unrest that we see. It's just kind of important to understand the context in which this is occurring. Okay. And so, I had some, kind of photographic evidence of what's going on in at least 2 U.S. cities. You're talking about very costly and dangerous civil unrest and riots. In D.C., there are estimates that the damage would have been roughly $200 million in today's dollars, inflation adjusted. Just kind of contextualize this. Now, the D.C. riots, many of the largest riots were in 1968 after the assassination of Martin Luther King. But they were also having some disturbances as well in the nation's capital. So again, part of this broader context, I just kind of want to remind that, you had quite a bit going on in the country, okay? You have protests surrounding the Vietnam War. Those also caused quite a bit of destruction. And you have a protester base in this instance that's largely white that actually ends up basically storming the Pentagon. They crossed over the Memorial Bridge, very noteworthy. You have a situation where you've got 20,000 casualties from the Vietnam War by 1967. And so the country in general, and I might look old to some of you, but I'm 39, so I wasn't actually around that. I'm reading about this stuff and studying it like many of you have and will. But this is a really difficult situation for the country on many dimensions, right? Just to kind of broadly contextualize this. But it is noteworthy that you had this battery of very relatively ambitious social welfare programs on poverty alleviation. You had Voting Rights Act of 1965. You had policies in place to try to expand access to the social safety net to Black Americans, where it had been previously closed off. And I think this is helpful to contextualize because in my reading, there really was a bit of regret and maybe even resentment on the part of President Johnson with respect to the idea that he felt like he was doing quite a bit on these very sorts of issues that Kerner would ultimately raise, right? And so again, I don't want to claim that there's one voice on these matters, but just sort of general reading of how this was seen, right? But part of what I want to do also is just kind of give you a sense for what the situation was. You're going to learn about all sorts of summary statistics, unemployment rates, poverty rates, and the like in your current course of study for the students here. And again, one measure can't fully characterize what's going on, but when you go back and look, you've got these kind of lagged indicators of some issues that are really going to crop up for the country. And you just kind of take a look here and imagine it, over 40% of Black Americans are at or below poverty in 1966. So, we're not talking about folks even who are just a little bit above the poverty line. This is staggering. It looks quite a bit worse if you look at families headed by a single female. Those rates are far higher. And so this is just one example of the economic situation that kind of predates this unrest. And there is an economic component here. It's the one I'm best trained to talk about. But as Alan kind of talked about as well, you had other factors. You had police-citizen interactions that were quite contentious and violent. You have a lot of stuff going on concurrent. And even masked in here with white poverty rates that are, in the red trend line far lower, it's worth noting, and I'll bring this up later in the talk, that there's a rural poverty problem. And actually, it turns out the president recognized this as well, and there were some efforts to try to think about this. And so these things are sort of being talked about in sort of separate domains, but I think that's relevant. So again, just kind of a, an aggregate statistic, doesn't get at that granularity. This is the kind of granularity that the commission was actually designed to really dig into, right? And so, look, they're really thinking about these high levels of concentrated poverty and unemployment, sort of isolation within cities where there's prosperity overall. And so they were focusing on at least 4 big issues: employment and educational opportunities, fair housing and access to fair and safe sanitary housing, and again, issues of police brutality, police misconduct. And, many of you have had a long day, and I shouldn't say this, but in a sense, this slide kind of makes the point. Is the Kerner Commission relevant today? Look at those bullet points. And I don't think this is even a partisan statement, that these are issues that are still prominent 50 years later, right? And we'll dig a bit more into that, but it's still quite relevant, even despite some improvements. So what did they do? And again, I'm trained as a labor economist, so I'm thinking a lot about unemployment trends, poverty trends, so on and so forth. But that's not the only way you can get at this problem. And the commission did great work. They went into the neighborhoods. They conducted interviews. They had hearings. And in fact, one of the great conversations that I was privy to was hearing from Senator Fred Harris. He talked about going to neighborhood restaurants, establishments, grocery stores, barbershops, talking to black men, black women, black children, black families, and hearing about how they viewed their experience in these cities, what it felt like for them, how difficult it was for them to find employment, so on and so forth. I had the chance to hear from him this September at a Kerner conference hosted by the Humphrey School. But the point is that you're triangulating around what's happening on the ground level. This is the great work that was done by the commission. And again, just for background, it's an interesting commission because you've also got at once quite a bit of diversity. And just to highlight, you had Roy Wilkins, who was director of the NAACP. You had Senator Brooke from Massachusetts, one of the few black senators in history. And you had the police chief from Atlanta, Georgia. That's actually kind of relevant because, interestingly, you've got most of the black population of the United States situated in the Southeast. But if you go back and look in history, you didn't see this sort of civil unrest occurring on nearly the same scale in the southern cities of, say, Atlanta, New Orleans, so on and so forth. And not that there weren't disturbances, but not nearly on the scale that you saw outside of the Southeast. And so, my reading of the composition of this commission was that, if you're a fan of LBJ, he's, whatever you may think, very politically savvy. And this group was put together, at least via my reading and research, to be constructed to be fairly moderate. And in the sense that he wasn't necessarily expecting particularly surprising or bold policy prescriptions to come about as a result. Roy Wilkins from the NAACP was a big Johnson supporter, and in part for the very reasons I just described for you in the previous slides. Pretty transformational policy action, right? So, with that, the core recommendations end up being quite bold for the day, and I would argue they're quite bold for 2018, 2019. Opening up opportunities, but with an emphasis for the role of racial segregation and discrimination, that those forces of structural factors had created barriers to employment, education, and housing. Some of you might select into friend groups, groups of people who think and view these things similarly, one way or another. You're in a School of Public Affairs at the La Follette school, maybe that's not a big deal. That's a big deal. It's a big deal for a presidential commission to come out and say this. And on the second point, there was this sense that people in these communities really did want the tools to be able to lift themselves up these economic ladders, remove the frustration of powerlessness among the disadvantaged. And I have a quote from Senator Ed Brooke. I think it's relevant here. His observation, and Brooke was hardly a radical. Brooke notes, the people who rioted during the summer of '67 were for the most part neither social misfits or habitual criminals. They were not alcoholics or drug addicts. They were not communists. They were not inspired by communists. They were not part of an organized conspiracy designed to bring down the U.S. by attacking its great urban centers. Rather, they're men and women who are driven by the fear and frustration which accompanies continuing second-class citizenship in a country dedicated to the principle of equality. Powerful words. And the third piece, and I think this is one that doesn't get the coverage it should, was that the commission really wanted to work on social cohesion. The notion that we didn't have the right cross-race dialogue, that we really were two societies. How do we create this common ground? How do we end mistrust? I alluded earlier to the parallel presidential commissions looking at rural poverty and essentially black urban poverty. How do you think about talking about the issues of the country and kind of merging them together? How do you do that better? So big recommendations, big issues that they bring up, right? And I certainly wouldn't hope to tackle all of that. What I want to talk about, relatively quickly is the work that I did with Marcus Casey. And, I'm pivoting here a little bit, talk about the data, show you some of what we found. Essentially, the goal was to identify black neighborhoods, and then neighborhoods in general, and then neighborhoods that were affected by rioting. And so what we were able to do here is use a data set called the Neighborhood Change Database. And so this is essentially census tract level data. But importantly, we're building upon the efforts of some other economic historians. Bob Margo and Bill Collins, they have data on where riots occurred in 4 major US cities. And so, Marcus and I did a battery of analyses and linked these 2 data sets together. And so the idea was just to kind of understand, how have black neighborhoods evolved overall? How did the neighborhoods affected by rioting evolve overall? And then how did the black neighborhoods affected by rioting evolve? And this is an important point. Not all the black neighborhoods had rioting, right? So we see some differences there. And I'll spoil it for you. What I'm really going to show you are a bunch of trends where the overall neighborhoods look better than the black neighborhoods, and the black neighborhoods look better than the neighborhoods that experience rioting. So, we'll see what that looks like here. And essentially, you can see on unemployment, again, the top trend line, if we're looking from 1970 through 2010, is unemployment rate, again, for black neighborhoods, the ones affected by riots. You see a pretty pronounced percentage point difference in the unemployment rate. And it actually goes up between 1970 and 1980. Again, this is actually decennial census data, and so you're going to see these jumps on a decadal basis, right? But again, if you saw the unemployment rate overall, and in the paper you can see all these tables, it would be lower than that for the black overall neighborhoods. On poverty and welfare, again, we see the welfare use trends that are basically doing this little table deal. And so what you see again is that neighborhoods that had rioting, well, again, poverty rates are approaching 30% and then level off a bit in more contemporary times. Higher than the national average for black neighborhoods overall, following a similar path, right? And then here, for those of you who will study social policy at La Follette, I can't make a causal claim, but this is certainly consistent with a bit of a retrenchment in welfare policies that we've seen in the mid to late 1990s. For example, cash welfare is not at all what it once was pre-1995, 1996. And then this also gets into some of the benefits that we do and don't count. But we see this pattern that emerges. But there is good news. On income and then on educational attainment, we see growth overall. And again, this is where we're comparing all neighborhoods. And you can see this difference. If you look carefully, the axes that we're comparing are just different out the gate because educational attainment is just higher for the overall neighborhoods, right? If we're just looking at black neighborhoods, though, it's still promising that we do see rising educational attainment in these black neighborhoods. Marcus and I did in the paper, we did go back and look at how the composition of these neighborhoods did or did not shift over time. And actually, as it turns out, most of the black neighborhoods that are black in 1970, and our definition is 40% or more black population, they essentially remain black by 2010, for the most part. You don't see much churning on that metric. So again, just to kind of conclude there, there's initial declines on many factors. You do have some improvements with respect to educational attainment, but the black neighborhoods look, in some respects, a lot like the riot-affected neighborhoods. A bit better, but they're following similar trends. And the riot-affected neighborhoods are lagging overall. Now, I should say, when you think about the damage done, you think about those events, just to give you another contextual factor for DC, I mentioned $200 million in damage. What I didn't mention is that you also had an occupation of military troops that was the largest since the Civil War. So, this is deep, this is impactful, but it's also indicative of a whole bunch of stuff that predated the riots themselves. It's not clear that in the absence of the riots, these neighborhoods were going to be doing great, right? So it's something to keep in mind. Alan talked about evidence-based policy, and part of what I want to do here, we're at La Follette, I want to talk about what we know. The report asks for and suggests strongly that we need robust economic policy interventions in these neighborhoods. And by many accounts, the federal government and state governments did not follow through nearly to the degree that Kerner Commission members would have suggested. Nonetheless, there were policy interventions that occurred on many domains that we now have evaluated. 50 years, and it's important to note that the U.S. government was actually enlisting folks like the Institute for Research on Poverty here at Wisconsin, researchers at the University of Michigan Survey Research Center. These institutions were at the forefront of actually doing the policy analysis, doing the work to figure out what's going to be effective in Great Society, what's going to be effective on these programs. And so you're sitting here right now, you're really in a very special place for social scientists, right? I mean, this is a place where the work's been done, and frankly, modern day social scientists are building off of that work that was done in the sort of 60s, 70s, and 80s. And I'm going to talk a bit about that evidence. But before we do, the questions that get asked really do also hinge on why you think we have a problem in the first place. You could teach a whole class on this sort of thing, but the debate that occurs today was also occurring back in the 60s, and if I were to kind of simplify it, it had a lot to do with whether the explanations for neighborhood poverty and neighborhood economic malaise were structural or more individual or cultural. And this has serious implications. The Kerner Commission really was more in the direction of thinking about these structural factors, these environmental, ecological factors, including access to job market opportunities, access to educational opportunities, stuff like that. On the other extreme, there was the thinking that those sorts of interventions just would not work. If you have people who don't have the work effort, They don't have the discipline. If there's a pathology that a particular group of people have, you could throw all the money in the world that you want at the problem, nothing's going to happen. And this is a debate that was occurring then. I would argue that that debate hasn't gone away. And so, again, Kerner was really pretty forceful on this more structural side. And, you know, my reading of the evidence is that there's a lot that worked. So I teach a class on social policy and programs back at AU. You've got a whole battery of scholars here, you know, including but not limited to Tim Smeating, Fenaba Addo, Sarah Halper-Meakin. There's too many to mention that know this literature and have contributed to it. But whether you're talking about food stamps causing long-term economic benefits, lifting people out of poverty, improving health outcomes, whether you're talking about the broader role of economic resources and income, both on an individual level that are going to raise test score outcomes, improve overall economic well-being. Even on the school level, there was a debate back in the 70s and 80s about whether or not throwing resources at schools would really improve their performance. We have credible causal evidence that, in fact, expenditures aren't the only thing, but they matter quite a bit positively. And you could go on and on. Early child care, rigorous evaluations of early child interventions and Head Start, one of the programs that Johnson enacted, matters positively for long-term earnings and economic well-being. And like I could teach a whole class on this, so, you know, I can kind of land the plane here a little bit. But neighborhood quality, and I'll close. Neighborhood quality, the long-term benefits of living in a higher quality neighborhood on metrics like income, school quality, so on and so forth. Long-term benefits. Educational interventions matter at the career and tech level. Medicaid benefits reduce bankruptcy. Now, this is relatively contemporary work, but it's building, it's standing on the shoulders of a lot of the work that's been done throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And so these things matter. Another thing that matters is social cohesion, that third point. Much of this work is now beginning to look at the role of economic conditions in rural America, the fissures that's created if we've been ignoring those trends. And so I want to take a moment to note that 2 years before Kerner, we had a presidentially commissioned report, The People Left Behind. This was on rural poverty. A lot of poverty that's in rural America is black poverty, but most of it's white poverty. And that's important also. And so this conversation is occurring today. You've got scholars and commentators ranging from J.D. Vance to Bell Sawhill, my colleague at Brookings, who are thinking hard about forgotten Americans, the other Americans, the notion that the policy process hasn't necessarily paid as much attention as it should to these rural issues. And I'll show you briefly some work from Jim Ziliak at Kentucky. If you look at this rightmost panel here, I just want to direct your attention to one key trend, which is just that from 1967 until 2015, folks with a, you know, less than a high school education, employment rates have gone from over 90% to basically 50% or below in current day terms. That's a big deal. That's a big problem, right? And I'm not really in the business of trying to rank order which is more important. And you certainly had compositional changes in rural America, but they're both important problems. It speaks to Alan's point about whether and how you have policy prescriptions that really promote cohesion, a rainbow coalition, if you will. And so I want to close by talking about some pathways forward here. The public policy interventions have worked. That's my reading of the literature, okay? We can talk about the literature, but just based on the evidence, I see quite a bit that's worked. Doesn't mean we can't do more. And I want to make the point that I'm a labor economist. I do believe in markets, believe markets can improve economic outcomes. And I don't think that it's socialism to promote strong social policies within a market economy. I think this actually gets confused quite a bit. And so, amen. It's like a slow clap almost. That's good. So I think this is going to require a sense of shared prosperity and an acknowledgement that some things have worked, right? So, I showed you those high poverty rates, but I'm going to show you that poverty rates might be still too high. But overall, for the groups that we're talking about, Black Americans, we do see poverty rates going from about 40% down at the end here. Where'd my red cursor go? There we go. And that's, in the 20s, low 20s. Now that's still almost double the national poverty rate, but it's also progress. And so we have to talk about the good and the bad here. Policy interventions at the local level. I do a lot of work on a program called the Earned Income Credit, and this is the largest transfer program for the poor today, larger than cash welfare. It's administered through the tax code. If you're taking La Follette classes, you know what it is probably. If you're about to, then you'll learn what it is. And so in DC, one of the things we find is that in the more prosperous parts of the city, comparing inequality trends from blue to orange, we see inequality reductions when we account for the Earned Income Credit. The 50-10 ratio is a common measure of inequality. But what's interesting is that when we look in the poorer parts of the city, Wards 7 and 8, we see that inequality is just lower in general. Our axes are 3 versus 4. But we also see larger inequality reductions in this part of the city after accounting for the EITC. And what's important here to note is that you've got a federal program that's also overlaid by a very generous city-state level program. 29 states have their own versions of the Earned Income Credit that come on top of the federal credit, right? And they make it even more generous. So much of the social policy action today is occurring at the subnational level, whether it's minimum wages, earned income credits, choices about Medicaid expansion, so on and so forth. It's an important point to keep in mind. 3 things that I'd recommend that are kind of in the domain of improving what we have. I think it'd still be pretty ambitious, but extending the aforementioned EITC to singles, right? Many non-custodials who are going to file single on the tax form are nonetheless supporting families. The work of Maria Conchian looked at this quite a bit. Families are more complex today, and we have to keep that in mind. Food stamp recipients, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP recipients, look a bit different today than they did in the past. Many of them are working a job and a half to 2 jobs, and they're living on the outskirts of many of the large cities. Their transportation costs are higher. They have less time to prepare that very efficient meal at home. And so with that said, there's been some great recommendations to scale up those benefits, kind of realizing the new reality of folks who are working poor and near poor. And then with welfare, got a lot of acronyms up here, temporary assistance for needy families. Many of the states use some of the accounting advantages, I think, afforded them through the block grant to supplant and plug some other budget holes. And they really did reduce the amount of spending on actual cash assistance. You think about welfare, a lot of you are picturing cash assistance. There was a great article with Kansas. NPR did this piece where they were going up to people and they're asking, well, you did this marriage promotion program, and it might be like a middle-class couple, 2 earners. They say, well, did you know you were on welfare? And they're looking back at the interviewer like, what? And well, it turned out that there were some relationship coaching classes that were actually funded by the state's TANF program. And so it just raises the question in terms of target efficiency, do you want the welfare dollars going in that direction? Maybe yes, maybe no. I'd say no. And so I think that we can also do more in welfare to basically create a safety net for job training. We think that there's opportunities for folks. Think about your own circumstance. I can't count 1 to 1, but I would imagine that many of us had support to go and get that undergraduate degree, that graduate degree. We didn't do it without some financial support. thinking about what it takes for someone to upgrade their skills, what are the supports that we would want them to have, right? So again, 3 ideas that I kind of wanted to put forth for you. Maybe time permitting, we'll do some Q&A here. So, okay, so going to be landing the plane, but I want to talk about where we are now. What you're looking at, and it's kind of hard to see, but this is an interesting graphic from Opportunity Insights. If you're hanging around tonight, you're thinking about the talk I gave, it's just still in your mind, still percolating. That's kind of funny because you're thinking about it. Yeah. Okay. So you're going to be thinking about this stuff, and you're going to say, well, how's DC doing today? This outlined area represents 7th Street Northwest in DC, where some of the major 1968 rioting occurred. And the research team at Opportunity Insights has allowed for a mapping of the economic conditions at a granular census tract level. It's actually quite fascinating and important work. And basically what you're seeing here is that children who were growing up in those neighborhoods throughout the 80s and 90s, if their parents were low income, they themselves in adulthood have incomes that are basically $15,000 or less. And that's compared just nearby, if you know DC, DuPont Circle, where there's a far higher likelihood of low-income kids growing up in adulthood to have far higher incomes, moving up the economic ladder. I won't claim to know what the sauce is in terms of the geography of poverty, but there's something going on here. And so we see this in evidence. We see this is basically a picture of low social mobility that is a very clear geographic gradient in a major city like Washington, D.C. If you go into the Opportunity Insights data, this is great work by Maggie Jones, as well as Raj Chetty and a team of academic economists. If you go in that data and you go look at your own city, I guarantee you're going to see some similar patterns. But today, if you were to go into the Shaw U Street neighborhood in and around 7th Street, looks quite a bit different. There's rapid redevelopment. My colleague Derek Hyra at American University has a great book looking at the demographic transition, race clash and politics in the Cappuccino City. To get that, DC used to be called the Chocolate City, so he did a thing with cappuccino. Anyways, yeah. Derek's clever. So Derek also has some work looking at the roots of the riot. So he's thinking about roots. He's thinking about the underlying factors that were causing riots in DC. And so, he and I talk a lot about this work and looking to see some more exciting stuff from Derek Hyra as well. But this does call into question the issue that as DC changes, we see more suburbanization of poverty. Scholars like Scott Allard have really documented this, that even as the neighborhood changes, who's going to be there, what's going to be the composition of poverty in our metropolitan areas. Tough questions, right? Looking back at these pictures, I'll also put forth that there's still similar themes of isolation and mistreatment. So, not quite the same, but not so different. And I'd argue that if you overlaid the issues of education, employment, housing, and police-citizen interactions, pretty relevant to Ferguson and Baltimore. And I only put forth the poverty rates as one of many summary statistics, almost double the national average, right? One of the issues that also came up in Ferguson as well as Baltimore had to do with the criminalization of being poor. Turns out many local governments have a very, very harsh monetary punishment regime. And this just kind of puts people behind the 8 ball. You get a parking ticket, you miss the parking ticket, the fee jumps up double or triple the amount. At some point, you have a warrant out. And, this sort of thing cascades. And I just kind of offered for you a screenshot for an event that's happening at Brookings this Friday because, sometimes you talk about these issues and it feels a bit squishy, right and wrong. And I think there's a moral component to this. But I guess I just wanted to offer up for La Follette scholars and students and prospective students that there's serious research and policy analysis being done to look at this system, to think about why this has occurred, why the public finance actually made sense for many localities, and what to do about it. How could we shift this in a way that makes more sense and really tries to tackle these problems head on, right? So this is actually coming up this Friday. I think it's the kind of thing you can download the papers on and maybe even do a streaming view of, right? So these issues are still relevant today. So, I guess I'd just close with the idea that we see these substantial differences in neighborhood quality. I'm going to argue that there's a higher variance of possibilities today. Alan talked about this. Higher variance of possibilities. You have a lot of Black Americans who are still struggling quite a bit, but you also have some great success stories as well. But that variance is troubling because that goes both ways. And I guess I want to get the current and future policy scholars and thinkers to consider that even with educational interventions, there's a social network aspect to whether or not we can lift people into economic opportunity. Part of the value of the education many of you are or will be getting here is that you're learning skills, but you're also working with each other, and you all are going to collectively be part of the policy thinking process both here in Wisconsin and across the nation. So you'll lean on each other. Those are networks, those are connections, you'll leverage those. How do we think about social networks, even if we solve the geography of poverty in terms of proximity? How does that work when it comes to a hiring choice? These are issues that are difficult to handle, but we gotta think about it pretty honestly, right? And so, overall, I'd just say Kerner Commission Report, the Russell Sage articles that came out in September, I think it's required reading for people who want to do place-based policy. And I'd encourage students and scholars here to at least take a look at the volume that came out in September. So, with that, I appreciate you guys, holding your attention and happy to answer some questions. Yeah.
Wow, that was terrific. We've got about 15 minutes for Q&A, and I'm very pleased to share with you that some of our La Follette students are going to lead that Q&A. They've been kind of thinking through what the top questions were to ask. We've got, not a great deal of time, but let's hear from our fabulous La Follette students, and we'll let Bradley and Alan sit in the hot seat.
Hi, so my name is Eleanor. I'm a La Follette student. Thank you both for your presentations. It was really interesting. So my question is that many of the policies that you highlighted are attempting to reverse some of the damage of a long history of white racism. And I'm curious about how we can recognize white racism in our current and proposed policies. So I'm thinking about things like work requirements being proposed in Medicaid and for SNAP. And I think that kind of comes from a history of white racist views about work ethic. So things like that.
I can scream, so. That's okay. I can. Oh, yep. You got problem solvers here at La Follette, so that's good. So, it's interesting. I've got a book chapter that I wrote with Trevon Logan and John Parman from William and Mary Logan's at Ohio State. We looked at basically the racial dimension of local policies and this history of a racial dimension to local public policies, spanning sort of redlining, housing policy that promoted segregation, to the very sorts of welfare policies you're talking about that demonize the poor, pathologize the poor, and that hurt a lot of white Americans in the process. And so you saw an example of this in Michigan, where there was a Medicaid work requirement proposal that was going to isolate urban areas and kind of hold harmless rural areas. It kind of had a clear racial dimension to it. It didn't pass, but I think this is a real issue. I think that I'm almost answering your question with another question, because I've thought about this as well. How do you create political coalitions also that can lead to policies being passed that will begin to remediate some of these issues, right? And I don't necessarily know the answer. I do think that some of the ideas that have been put forth, even including federal job guarantees, they're universal, but they can have some big positive disproportionate impacts. You have a recent National Academies study that basically creates a battery of prescriptions to reduce child poverty in half, co-authored by one of your professors here, Timothy Smeating. That's a universal set of policies that will, again, have a disproportionate impact for many Black and brown Americans, for example. So this is something I think about quite a bit, and I don't claim to have a kind of a closed form answer, but I think it's one of the questions, right? So I'll stop there. I could say more, and if you guys get me, a little bit tipsy, maybe I'll say even more. I don't know. But here's Alan.
Well, you can write a paper about what you should do and get an A. And that's important for your life. But what about communicating these realities and communicating what works to the general American audience and to your Uncle Earl at Thanksgiving, who's going to be nasty on a lot of these issues? Shouldn't schools of public administration weave in a notion of a media savvy? Shouldn't you be doing more of that sort of thing? There's a professor at University of Pennsylvania, Paul Offit. He's at the medical school, and he's battling the people who say you shouldn't vaccinate your kids. And he marched. He was participant in the March for Science in 2017, saying scientists should have a better say. And he talks about how he was doing a lousy job in communicating his positions, and so he started trying to appear on Morning Joe and all the mainstream talk shows, and he was terrible at first, and even the television crew staff were laughing at him. But he worked hard, and Penn has a great school of communications, and so he learned. So why can't you take that concern that you have in your head and communicate it to the wider audience? And finally, why don't you look at someone like Cornell Brook, who is the former president of the NAACP, who's now teaching advocacy at the Kennedy School. You can do policy analysis, but communicate what works and communicate the reality of white racism, but then go out there and do it. Do the advocacy to create the new will. I haven't heard much talk about how to create new will this afternoon. To me, that's the most important part of the Kerner Commission. And when I speak at universities, it's usually the same way. University audiences are sort of perplexed at how to create new will. But I think the school here should take on new will and should have requirements. And maybe you should be out in the field creating a new will, especially as we head towards 2020. Maybe that's not all you wanted to hear, but Bradley and I are on the same wavelength.
Hi, I'm Emily, and my question is, the Kerner Commission focused on disparities between white and black citizens, but given the increasing acknowledgement that racial diversity in the U.S. is not binary in nature, as well as citizenship, what recommendations would you give policymakers to ensure equity across racial categories in America?
That's a great question, and again, I think you acknowledged in your question the context, right? And the context at the time, and even the racial characteristics of the situation in these cities was relatively more binary, right? And so I do think, though, that if you'd seen some of the poverty rates and the unemployment rates, and frankly, I had those, I took it out due to kind of trying to create a very clear signal. You'd see that for many other groups, for example, there's great work at the city level that Sandy Darity, Derek Hamilton, and a series of co-authors have been doing, where they want to disaggregate the Asian category. If you look at census data, we oftentimes lump whole large swaths of people into something we're calling Asian. And in fact, if you disaggregate, you learn that there are all sorts of poverty and mobility and employment issues among many subgroups of this broader category, right? And so, I mean, my own thinking is that many of these prescriptions would resonate and be effective for these other groups as well, to be very blunt. And this isn't impugning the statistical agencies, right? I mean, these are challenging things that the statistical agencies have evolved on in terms of measuring these groups and their economic well-being. So, you know, on the one hand, I'd say Kerner had a very clear focus. I do think that there are, frankly, positive externalities. Like, a lot of this stuff's just good economic policy that helps Americans out. And I think even to the first question and to Alan's response, some of this is about communicating to people what the actual facts are on social welfare policy. That many, if not most, you know, folks who are receiving some sort of welfare benefit are working if they have the physical capacity to. These are facts that aren't commonly understood. There's a lot of tropes and stereotypes about, you know, what that looks like, right? So I think these policies would be effective for many different groups.
The executive director of the Kerner Commission was David Ginsburg, was a friend, and David always pointed out to me that in the first couple of pages of the Kerner Commission report, there's a stress on African Americans, but there is also the wording that says, and we all also need to focus on Latinos and on Native Americans. So it was in the Kerner report, even though the majority of the report was focused on what happened in African American neighborhoods in the cities. In our 50-year update, we're trying to embrace all of those groups in line with what you're saying. So our chapter on Latinos was written by Henry Cisneros, former HUD secretary, former mayor of San Antonio. And so we're going to be talking at MALDEF and at Unidas US, and with the mayor of Puerto Rico, mayor of San Juan in Puerto Rico, on Latino specific issues. Similarly, with Fred Harris, who's my co-author on our update, we're going to have a forum in Albuquerque in which we'll have a real serious debate with Native Americans. So all of the issues, whether it be demand side over supply side economic policy, or public school investment versus privatization, or prison building versus the reverse, or a decent housing policy, for all of those issues, basic issues, we need in our more diverse society and country to look at those groups. And so we are doing that. Whether or not it will impact on the 2020 election is another question.
You know, and I would add very quickly, I promise, very quickly. Here we go, okay. This isn't directly related, but I think it fits here. Just a little known fact that I learned about when I was in graduate school in the Poverty Center of Kentucky, that when Jesse Jackson rolled out his presidential campaign in the early 80s, you know where he was really popular? Eastern Kentucky. Yeah. And so I think that we tell this story, and sometimes there's a polarization there, but there are common policies, and a lot of people get behind these things. And I think all of us have to be careful, me included, that we don't forget that there's some storytelling to be done. And there is a question, and this is a bit out of my domain as an economist, but will politicians go to the people and try to have the conversation? And maybe you'll lose, but you might be surprised sometimes, right?
My name is Lily. My question is, the Black Lives Matter movement has brought the issue of disparate policing practices back into the public consciousness, which you spoke to. What strategic advice would you give the movement on how to reduce disparities in our justice system?
Three weeks ago, I addressed the Major City Police Chiefs Association in Washington. It was a day after the president addressed them. So I gave a progressive view of the reform that is needed for policing, and that focuses on using community policing in the kind of neighborhoods that Bradley talks about. And as I said in my presentation, police use the term community-based policing very freely, and usually it's a public relations gimmick. But we've actually trained police officers to be mentors with disadvantaged young people, and also do policing in the neighborhoods in ways that reduce crime, improve the lives of the kids, reduce fear, increase trust. And so we'll be talking with all the police organizations. So NOBLE, the National Organization of Black Law Enforcers, we'll be talking with IACP, International Association of Chiefs of Police. We'll be trying to get the police to go in this direction of community policing, not only to mentor the kids, but to stabilize the neighborhood, to encourage community-based banking, to encourage community-based economic development, to generate jobs for people in the community as well as returning ex-offenders. And so it gets back to multiple solutions. And then in terms of mass incarceration, yeah, we need to follow the states, as I said, like California, New York, and New Jersey, which have reduced their prison populations. And we got to start trying to put on the benches judges who want to reverse mass incarceration. It's about 45% of all federal judges are ex-prosecutors, so they're going to be pretty nasty in terms of sentencing. And only about 15% are former defense attorneys, and that's why I was suggesting that people like Sherilyn Ifill be considered for the Supreme Court as a long-run strategy to really reverse mass incarceration, which really is our present version of slavery and Jim Crow.
I would just add to this, and it's a bit kind of parallel to Alan's point. There's been some interesting work by a scholar out of Yale, Tom Tyler. He's a social psychologist, basically, by training. And a lot of his work has been shown to look at the role of really police retraining and really getting at the issues of aggressiveness, issues of masculinity and respect that the police actually bring to their work. And he's been doing some of the cutting edge work for years on really kind of low-cost tools to think about how you can reform that interaction in the first place. And it's a heavy lift, but you have seen some instances where if you have leadership that actually want to kind of do that work, thinking about why your workforce has a hostile attitude towards the people in the community in the first place, and really putting the time in, I think some of the evidence suggests that like there could be improvements. So that's not like directly all the things with respect to the Black Lives Matter question, but I do think you don't necessarily see all the local police departments buying into that sort of thing, right? So,
when I talk to the major chiefs, a lot of the major chiefs are sort of older white guys who I'm not sure were very big on it, but there was the new African-American police chief of Seattle, a woman who came up and said, yeah, that's exactly what we want to do. And you know, if you get back to will. If we can get at least some progressive chiefs to go in a new direction, then we can build on it. We've taken delegations of American police chiefs to Japan, and the Japanese police chiefs took them to their training academy, and there were cadets learning tea ceremony and flower arrangements. And the American police chiefs yucked it up and laughed. And they said, "Why are you doing this?" And the Japanese said, "Well, to learn respect for the culture." And so we took the Americans back, and we tried to invest that notion of being sensitive to the culture into the strain of community policing across the nation.
So it's the witching hour for us. I have a couple thank yous. I want to start off by thanking Bridget Pierce, who organized this event for us. Too often, Bridget gets missed, and she ought never be missed. I also want to thank Dr. Alan Curtis for originating the idea of having this lecture today and bringing some really provocative ideas here to campus. I want to thank Dr. Bradley Hardy for sharing his information, statistics, and evidence-based policy solutions. Boy, I like that. I want to thank our La Follette students, especially our diversity and inclusion group, which really led the way in terms of gathering questions and has been pushing us to do more. Thank God. Thank you for you. Thank you to our students and our faculty who are here, to the Institute for Research on Poverty, which has led the way in research in this area for decades. And thank you to our La Follette prospective students. I hope you come. Join me for a reception following this, and thank you again to our speakers.